If you approach a pristine shoreline target and the water is perfectly still, how do you know if the base are simply absent, or if they are sitting right there, completely locked up because they knew you were coming before you even saw the water? The reality of bank fishing is that the vast majority of fish you spook never make a splash, never push a wake, and never give you a visible sign that they just aborted their feeding window. They simply sink 2 feet down into the water column, flare their fins to hold position, and completely shut down their aggressive feeding behavior. And the data on base sensory physiology shows exactly why this happens long before you make your first cast. Largemouth bass possess an incredibly sensitive mechanosensory lateral line system that registers low-frequency water displacements from 1 to 200 Hz. This means the vibrations from heavy footsteps on a soft, muddy bank transmit directly into the water as seismic pressure waves. You think you are sneaking up on a spot, but to a bass holding near the shoreline, the pressure changes are hitting their lateral line like a drumbeat. By the time you see the perfect piece of cover, the fish has already shifted its priority from hunting to defense. This video covers 3 specific things that happen on the bank: how shoreline soil density changes the way a bass detects your approach, how the angle of your shadow intersects with a bass's visual window, and why casting directly at a visible target is the fastest way to get rejected. None of this requires specialized stealth gear or expensive tackle. It all comes down to understanding the physics of how your presence enters the water and adjusting your geometry before you unhook your lure. Most bank anglers believe that staying quiet means not talking and not dropping tackle boxes, but sound traveling through the air actually has very little impact on fish below the surface, because up to 99% of acoustic energy bounces off the water's surface due to the impedance mismatch between air and water. Airborne noise isn't the problem. Groundborne vibration is the problem. A bass doesn't care if you're talking on your phone, but it absolutely cares if you step heavily on a hollow, undercut bank, sending a low-frequency shockwave directly into its holding area. This completely changes the rules of engagement for a bank angler. It means the most important part of your cast actually happens 15 feet before you reach the edge of the water. But understanding ground vibrations doesn't explain why a perfectly silent approach still results in a fish that follows your bait but refuses to bite. And the answer to that has nothing to do with how quiet your feet were, but rather how you managed the visual geometry between you, the bait, and the sun. Before we get into the visual angles, we need to look at what the water itself is telling you about where your bait should land. Let's look at a classic bank fishing scenario: a large fallen oak tree extending from the dry bank out into 8 feet of water. The wrong cast happens when an angler walks right up to the trunk of the tree on the bank, stands tall to get a good look at the branches, and pitches a jig directly into the thickest part of the cover. The lure enters with a vertical splash, drops straight down, and the angler feels nothing. This cast failed before the lure even hit the water. By standing right next to the trunk, the angler sent ground vibrations down the wood, alerting every fish relating to that root system. By standing tall, they silhouetted themselves against the sky, placing their entire upper body inside the bass's Snell's window, the 97-degree cone of vision that allows fish to see above the surface. And by dropping the lure directly on the target, they force the bait to displace water aggressively in a vertical plane, which triggers a startle reflex rather than a feeding response. Now look at the right cast on that exact same fallen tree. The angler stops 15 feet back from the shoreline, using the bank's natural slope to keep their profile low. Instead of casting at the trunk, they cast parallel to the shoreline, targeting the outer edges of the submerged branches where the tree meets the open water. They land the lure 5 feet past the structure and slowly bring it into the strike zone horizontally. This cast works because it respects the bass's sensory boundaries. There is no seismic warning, no visual silhouette, and the bait arrives behaving exactly like natural prey, which swims horizontally into cover rather than falling like a rock from the sky. But what happens when there is no visible wood to target? Consider a long, straight weed line running parallel to the bank with a sharp drop-off just 3 feet from the edge. The wrong cast here is throwing the bait straight out into the deep water and dragging it back up the drop-off toward the angler's feet. As the bait approaches the edge of the weeds, the angler's shadow is stretched out across the water, covering the exact transition zone where the fish are waiting to ambush prey. When the bass tracks the bait up the slope, it suddenly hits that wall of unnatural shadow and flares off, abandoning the chase. The right cast requires looking at the sun before looking at the water. The angler positions themselves so the sun is in their face or hitting their side, ensuring their shadow falls on the grass behind them, not on the water in front of them. Then, they cast parallel to the weed line, keeping the bait in the high percentage transition zone for the entire retrieve. The lure never enters a shadow boundary. The fish never sees a silhouette. And the strike happens with confidence because the bass feels no conflicting environmental data. The third scenario involves clear water and hard bottom transitions, like a rocky point tapering off a mud bank. The wrong cast is throwing a heavy, vibrating bait on thick braided line directly onto the rocks. In clear water, a bass relies heavily on its vision to confirm what its lateral line is feeling. When a heavy lure crashes into the water, the low-frequency thud signals a massive intrusion. The thick line vibrating through the water column creates a secondary acoustic trail that does not match the size of the bait. The bass feels a threat, sees a small lure, and the sensory mismatch causes it to lock down. The right cast on this clear rocky point involves a subtle entry and a natural presentation. The angler feathers the spool right before the bait lands, ensuring a silent, horizontal entry into the water. They use a long fluorocarbon leader, which sinks and cuts through the water without producing the heavy hum of braided line. The bait moves across the rocks, ticking the bottom gently, sending out the exact high-frequency clicks of a foraging crawfish. The lateral line registers small, erratic movements, the eyes confirm a natural profile, and the base commits to the strike. Everything covered so far, the ground vibration, the visual silhouette, the shadow lines, and the entry splashes, assumes that when a base follows a lure and turns away, it means you did something wrong. But a base in a highly pressured environment uses its senses differently. That slow follow where the fish trails your bait all the way to the bank and then slowly turns around isn't necessarily a rejection of your stealth. It is an inspection. The bass's lateral line has neuromasts that detect pressure waves, and by following your lure closely without eating it, the fish is actually riding the pressure wave generated by your bait. It is gathering data. If you stop the bait dead when you see the fish following, the pressure wave vanishes instantly. The lateral line goes dead, and the fish loses interest because real prey doesn't simply turn off its propulsion. The sudden loss of water displacement is the ultimate red flag. Instead of freezing, the right move is to subtly accelerate or change the angle of the retrieve, keeping the pressure wave active but altering its frequency. You aren't trying to trick the fish's eyes. You're trying to keep its lateral line engaged long enough for its predatory instincts to override its caution. The follow without an attack isn't a failure of your cast. It is the bass telling you that the initial presentation was good enough to pull it from cover, but the continuous pressure wave didn't trigger the final commit. Next time you see that slow turnaround, Don't change your lure immediately. Change the hydrodynamic footprint of the retrieve during the last 10 feet of the cast. The next time you're on the bank and can't decide when to move because a spot looks too perfect to leave, there is a video here that answers exactly how to calculate when a zone is truly dead. Subscribing is how you find it. To keep your bank fishing simple and effective, remember these 3 criteria before you make your first move. Manage your ground vibration first. Control your visual silhouette second. Land the bait past the target third.